Okay, on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, I'd like to welcome you all to our final event for the fall academic quarter. We're very honored to have the distinguished and prominent Turkish journalist, author, and public intellectual Mustafa Akyol with us today. Mustafa is based in Istanbul, where he writes a regular column for the Hurriyet Daily news, which is the foremost English language daily in Turkey. He's the author of the critically acclaimed book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, on sale outside of this room after the talk. Mustafa has authored 5 books in Turkish, including Rethinking the Kurdish Question, published in 2006, and his writings on Turkish affairs, on Middle Eastern affairs, have been published in numerous journals and forums such as Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Financial Times, just to name a few, and he's also a frequent commentator on Turkish affairs on CNN, Al Jazeera, and the BBC. Mustafa just happened to be on a book tour here in the United States at this time. We were able to piggyback off of his presence here thanks to our friends in the Mosaic Foundation. And so he has agreed to come to give a talk on a very important subject, as announced, as advertised, the state of democracy in Turkey, assessing Erdoğan and the Justice and Development Party. Now, our center has a special theme, a special focus that seeks to look at, examine, pursue research on the intersection between religion and democracy in the Middle East and the broader Islamic world. Of course, the question of Turkey is really central to that particular theme. In many ways, the rise of the AK Party to political power in 2002, in many ways, put this issue of Islam and democracy, religion and democracy on the regional map, on the academic agenda, on the social science agenda. And now, almost 12 years in power, 10, 12 years in power, there are deep questions about where Turkey is headed, what the state of democracy is, to what extent is the AK Party presiding over a transition to democracy, or is there a retrenchment and rolling back of democracy in Turkey? And to help us sort of assess and evaluate and analyze that question is someone who is in the thick of the debate, who's in the middle of the debate, who has given these questions much greater thought than I have, and that's Mustafa Akyol. He will speak for approximately 30 to 40 minutes maximum, and afterwards our colleague Joseph Szyliowicz will be a commentator. Joseph is not only a full professor here, but he's an affiliate of our Center for Middle East Studies, but more importantly, he is a longtime scholar of Turkey, and I thought the best person to sort of engage in a discussion and to perhaps get Mustafa to sort of maybe push him a little bit, but not too far, on this particular question would be someone who actually knows Turkey and has been studying it for much longer than perhaps everyone in this room. And so I will facilitate a back and forth between Joe Szyliowicz and Mustafa. Then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions and answers. And without any further delay, let me sort of ask you to join me in welcoming Mustafa Akyol to the University of Denver.
Well, thank you for this very generous introduction, and thanks for the warm welcome. And thanks for coming here. I mean, I'm sure there are more fun things to do out there in this sunny afternoon, but thanks for being with us today. First of all, I should say, in Turkey, whenever you make an assessment of Turkey, people wonder, if they don't know you, like who you are exactly and what's your agenda, and what do you want to achieve. And I'm sure people are not that questioning probably here in the US, but still let me tell who I am and what's my agenda for Turkey, what do I want to achieve before assessing the current situation. Culturally and theologically speaking, I'm a Muslim and I'm proud of that. Islam is the source of my values and it gives meaning to my life. It's theology, I believe and I think also it's just the latest version of the Abrahamic monotheism, which has also been expressed by Christianity and Judaism in the past. So that's very important for me. But politically speaking, and I don't think that Islam gives me a political ideology, politically speaking, I'm a liberal. In other words, I believe in liberty as the basis of human societies. In other words, I want to see a more liberal Turkey in which every individual will be able to pursue his or her goals, values, ambitions, and do their mistakes and learn from them. Have their right to pursue for the pursuit of happiness, as one of your founders put it very nicely in, I think, one of the core texts of the United States. In other words, I would love to see a Turkey in which Turkey's like Sunni Muslims, Alevi Muslims, Turkey's seculars, agnostics, or non-practicing cultural Muslims, or Turkey's Christians and atheists, Kurds and Armenians and Greeks and the Turkish majority all would have unlimited freedom, unless, of course, they violate the freedom of others. So I think that would be my ideal Turkey. And I look at our political history from this perspective, from a liberal perspective, and try to understand what are our problems from this liberal perspective and how we can solve these problems and move towards a more liberal and democratic future. I also should say that I sometimes make a distinction between liberal democracy and illiberal democracy, because the term illiberal democracy has been coined by political scientist, and Fareed Zakaria, I think, made it very famous. Because if democracy is just about elections, but civil liberties are not protected in a democracy, you can run into the tyranny of the majority. And I think that's an important concept to keep in mind when we are assessing Turkey's affairs today. Anyway, this is just, about what I would like to see, who I am, and what is my vision about Turkey. But what is happening in Turkey and how I see the recent history. Let me, say a few things about that. One thing I think we should always emphasize when discussing Turkey is that, the Republic of Turkey is the heir of the Ottoman Empire. And that explains a lot of things about the Republic of Turkey. It's the heir of the Ottoman Empire. First of all, this has a lot of ethnic consequences, because the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious entity in which you had Turks at the core of the empire, but there were not just Turks, but Kurds, Arabs, Albanians, Bosniaks, Armenians, Jews, Greeks, a lot of people. And the Ottoman Empire had protected its non-Muslims and also had made them equal citizens with the Islahat Edict of 1859-56, which ultimately was on the verge of creating a Islamic, in the sense that it was a caliphate, a caliph was running the Ottoman Empire, but in the sense, it was on the verge of becoming a democracy, because the Ottoman Empire had opened up a parliament in which competing parties could compete, and equal citizenship for non-Muslims. There I see important roots of liberalism in late Ottoman Empire, and Islamically justified liberalism. And I think that's an important story that many people forgot. Today there are some people called the Salafis in the Middle East. They reject all the innovations that the Ottoman already had done, 150 years ago when it comes to equality of citizens or participatory democracy. And in my book, I try to put some light on those Ottoman reforms, which might give us some vision today. But anyway, the Ottoman Empire collapsed in a horrific way. And there are some horrific tragedies that emerged from that collapse, including the ethnic cleansing of Armenians, for example, in Anatolia. I think a tragedy that Turks should be a bit more empathetic today. And after the fall of the empire, of course, all these different nation states emerged in the Middle East. And Turkey is just one of them. 27 nation states emerged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, from Serbia to Yemen. Basically, much of the Balkans and what's called the Middle East. After that, Turkey became a republic, a secular republic, and a nation state. And these two concepts are worth examining a little bit. I'm in favor of a secularism if it is a bit like in the US. In other words, if it means really protecting religion from the state, as well as protecting the state from religion. But Turkey incorporated its secularism from the Third Republic of France, which was partly anti-clerical in its nature. Therefore, Turkish secularism has had an authoritarian strain, which was manifested in the fact that one of the first things to do in the secular republic was that Ataturk, the leader of Turkey after the founding, during and after the founding, He, for example, banned all Sufi orders and religious educational institutions, which in my mind is a violation of secularism, because religion should be free in civil society if secularism is a liberal principle. And over the years, also this authoritarian strain in Turkish secularism has been manifested in other authoritarian, injunctions of the state, such as the ban on the headscarf. The Islamic, the traditional headscarf, which is worn by maybe half of Turkish women, generally voluntarily, was banned in all state institutions, in all public square, in all schools, in all universities. And that's why, Turkish female students who wanted to go to the West, who wanted to go to university, they couldn't go to Istanbul University, but they came to the US to get freedom and, to be able to practice their religion and get their education. So that part of Turkish secularism was a problematic part. And when Turkey's religious conservatives challenged this secularism over many times, during the Republic, I've always thought that, well, they have the right to challenge the authoritarian part of that secularism, but of course they should accept secular state in a more liberal form. And the AKP, the Justice and Development Party that we're discussing, actually did this on principle. They said, we are not against secularism at all. We like secularism if it means freedom of religion as well. They just challenged the interpretation of secularism made by Turkey's more authoritarian secularists. For example, they defended the right to wear the headscarf in universities and in the parliament. And I think these are all good signs for Turkey, that, now you can wear the headscarf if you want to, and you can enter the campus, the university. In this sense, I'm not very much in agreement with the more alarmist secular narrative about the AKP saying that actually they are destroying secularism. Our secularism is already problematic. That's the one issue with secularism. The other main issue, main trouble, or main discussion in Turkey is the principle of nationalism. As we said, the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic entity. So you did not have to be a Turk in the Ottoman Empire to be a citizen. You could be Arab, you could be Kurdish, you could be Bosnian, you were all Ottomans. But the Turkish Republic decided to define every citizen as a Turk. And this created some problems, because some people said, actually, we are not Turks, but we are something else. And the most largest non-Turkish group was the Kurds, which makes them 15% of Turkish society today. And from the beginning of the Republic, Kurds resisted this policy of assimilation, which wanted to Turkify them by defining them as Turks, by banning the Kurdish language, by banning any publication, even music in the Kurdish language for decades. And some people, here's one thing, this was not racism, it was not discrimination against the Kurds. Quite the contrary, it was assimilationism. It was trying to incorporate them into the larger, monolithic nation. In this sense, Turkish nationalism too has been an illiberal principle. It could have been defined in a more liberal way, as some people had argued in the beginning of the Republic, but it has been an illiberal principle. And the AKP, the current Justice and Development Party, challenged this nationalism as well and brought more freedom to the Kurds in Turkey. The Kurdish language has become liberated in the past 10 years under the AKP because, it was before the AKP, it was forbidden to broadcast in Turkish. It was forbidden to have even a language course in Kurdish. Now it's all free. And now even you have Kurdish education in Turkish schools. You have Kurdish classes in Turkish schools. And there's even a state TV that broadcasts in Kurdish. So from these very paradigmatic issues, secularism and nationalism, I don't see a problem with the governing party. I think actually they have made some reforms which helped advance the liberal cause. And that's why Turkey's secular liberals supported Erdoğan and his party for quite many years. They also destined Turkey towards Europe in their initial years, and that was also a blessing for Turkey's secular liberals. So another thing, the rights of Christians in Turkey. Turkey has very few Christians. We had many more Christians during the Ottoman Empire. They were an integral part of the nation's system. But unfortunately, we decided to get rid of them as Greece decided to get rid of its own Muslims and Turks. So we had population exchanges. And of course, the expulsion of Armenians decreased the number of Christians in Turkey. And these Christians had, although they have certain rights given them by the constitution, their churches were closed, educational institutes were closed because of nationalism, because they were seen as the fifth column of the neighboring Greece, which we have big problems over Cyprus, for example. The AKP liberated Christians in Turkey as well, to a great extent. I mean, churches that are closed for 80 years have been opened in the past decade. There are still some problems like the Halki Seminary, which is still not open, and Erdoğan should do that as soon as possible. But on this issue too, I think the current government, the AKP, did good things. This is the brighter part. Now I'm coming to the not that bright part, which is becoming more and more obvious in the past few years. AKP gradually lost its reformist, liberal, democratic narrative, especially in the past few years. And now we are seeing a more strident rhetoric by the prime minister, some of the people in his party, and we are growingly seeing the signs of what I can call an illiberal democracy or elected authoritarianism. Why is this happening? The biggest explanation is, I think, an observation by Lord Acton, the great liberal thinker of the 19th century England. He said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We are seeing the signs of that corruptive effect of power in the ruling circles. They are winning every election, which is making them growingly self-confident, over-self-confident. They have assumed the state power, which in the past they saw as a problem. Now they own it, and they're enjoying to use that state power. Therefore, instead of decentralizing the political system, which they had promised before, when they got onto the other side of the fence, when they had the establishment in their hands, they thought that maybe it's actually not bad. For example, one of the liberal causes in Turkey has been the abolition of the institution called YÖK in Turkish, which means the Higher Education Council. The Higher Education Council in Turkey, which you don't have in the US, is a government body that controls all universities. Here in the US, if I'm not wrong, all universities govern themselves, right? I mean, they're of course constrained by law, but Obama doesn't appoint somebody who gives orders to Harvard University or the University of Denver. Well, in Turkey, we have this Higher Education Council, to whom all the university, administrators are responsible. Who created this? Well, not the AKP, the military who launched coups in the past and who want to control everything in Turkey. And one of the liberal causes in Turkey is the abolition of this Higher Education Council. And AKP would be doing a great thing if they came to power and abolished the Higher Education Council, from which they were complaining for years, because the Higher Education Council was issuing statements that a headscarf should not be allowed. But when they appointed someone they liked to the Higher Education Council, they said, why should we abolish it? It's really good. This is the real issue that's happening. I mean, the AKP came as a group of underdogs who were oppressed by an authoritarian elite. They claimed for liberty and liberation and democratization and so on and so forth. And it was not a trick or anything, but gradually, the more they owned the system, now they're looking at the system not as a problem, but as an asset. I think that's the main issue. And Erdoğan's personality plays a role here as well. Prime Minister Tayyip Erdoğan, who has done great things for Turkey, especially economy, building of the country, infrastructure. He's made many good liberal reforms as well. But he is obviously not a person who has a strong suit for compromise, reconciliation. He has this character of an underdog who has risen up to the top and who always fights and wins every battle. Maybe winning those battles was a good thing when his enemies, his rivals were the generals who were trying to overthrow him. But now it is just some youngsters in a park in Istanbul who want to oppose a public, the construction of a mall instead of that park. Maybe you shouldn't see them now as another target to intimidate, but just people that you should reason with. Well, that particular character of the prime minister, which always not always, but most of the time prefers confrontation over consensus, which also has deep roots in the political culture, is also a new problem that we're seeing today. So if you ask me, if you want a summary from me, I would say, well, AKP has done great things for Turkey, but we are probably coming to the end of the shelf life of that great narrative of their liberation. What will happen in the future? Well, if there can be an AKP version 2.0 somehow, how? Well, maybe Erdoğan becomes a president as he wants to be, and maybe there's a new leader in AKP which has a more liberal perspective that can help. Because I know that, it's obvious that in the AKP there are also still some more liberal-leaning figures who are not happy with this recent toughness, which also became very apparent in the Gezi Park protests. Even Vice Prime Minister Bülent Arınç has been voicing that line, and right now there's a tension between the Deputy Prime Minister Arınç and Prime Minister Erdoğan, the two men who founded the AKP together with Abdullah Gül, the president. So there's a growing rift actually within the party, and some people are getting growingly unhappy with this strident attitude that we see in Prime Minister and his supporters. Whether this will lead to a new reform, a version 2.0, we will see, or whether the more radical line will growingly become more powerful, I can't foresee right now. But this is where we are right now. One more thing. It would be very, very good if we had an opposition party which was competent, which could convince people that they can run the economy well and really govern Turkey, and which were more liberal than Erdoğan and on all these issues. It would be heaven on earth. But unfortunately, we don't have that, and maybe that's the burning problem. The main opposition party, CHP, which is certainly more secular than the AKP, is not necessarily more liberal than the AKP. Ask them on the Kurdish issue, ask them on the minority issues, ask them on individual rights. They only care about some secular issues, which are important, but they would not be that open-minded when it comes to Kurdish issue, because I think they are still tied to the founding narrative of Turkey, the Kemalist narrative, which Ataturk devised according to his time and milieu. But times have changed a lot. It is true that Ataturk has turned his face to Europe in the 20s and 30s, and he did great things for Turkey. But Europe was not a pretty place in the 20s and 30s. And Turkey got some of its Western ideas, not from England or America, but from Italy. We got our fascist Italy, for example. So some of the dogmas that the main opposition venerates today as Kemalism, Ataturk's legacy, were not the greatest ideas. And they should be maybe replaced with a more liberal attitude today. So maybe the way out would be the evolution of a more liberal, social democratic opposition, which we unfortunately don't have. That's why I'm still putting my hope in the evolution of an AKP version 2.0, but we will see whether it will happen in the next few years. Thank you.
Well, Mustafa, thank you for that very brief but also very comprehensive and sort of concise assessment of the state of democracy in Turkey. I see that Joe Szyliowicz has been taking some copious notes, and I'm hoping he'll share them with us. So, Joe, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah. Basically, I agree completely with what Mr. Erdoğan has said about trends in Turkey. However, I think I would be even a little more gloomy than he has been. For several reasons. First of all, as many of you may know, over the last few years, there's been a mass trial of military officers and opposition and people who were opposed to the AK. These two mass trials were known as Ergenekon and Sledgehammer, and only a few weeks ago, the Sledgehammer verdict was passed, and a few hundred people were sent to jail, including many former high-ranking military officers. The whole idea of these trials was to unearth something called the deep state, which Turks often talk about. In other words, there is a feeling that within Turkey, there is somehow a group, a very large group, organized to overthrow the government. And these trials were supposed to unearth this. However, very little evidence was produced. There were numerous contradictions. And in fact, to give you just one example, the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering have a human rights committee. And 8 academics were jailed in these trials. The NASNA sent a committee to investigate whether or not these people who were found guilty were in fact guilty, and unanimously concluded that there was no proof to justify their conviction. So you have serious questions being raised about the rule of law in Turkey and the kind of judicial system that has emerged. Secondly, you have what I would call pressure on the media. And I'm sure that Mr. Erdoğan can talk much more eloquently and in detail about this, but there have been cases of pressure brought against a large media organization, the Doğan Group, of journalists being jailed, and of course that old bugaboo of self-criticism, or let's call it self-restraint, by the journalists. So there are, it seems to me, some very, very serious trends that suggest that Turkey is no longer the kind of model that many of us had hoped it would become in the early days of the AKP regime. I'm not sure I share the optimistic perspective that if Erdoğan becomes president, that this will be a step forward. Among other things, I think he would like to be president with a revised constitution that will give him extensive powers, and that the basic aim of Mr. Erdoğan and his colleagues is basically to create an illiberal democracy in Turkey, one where the AK will continue to rule for many, many years to come, even though elections are held. Two other quick points. There is a very large organization headed by Mustafa Gülen, a liberal Islamic scholar and leader. I'm sorry, Fethullah Gülen, of course. Thank you. And I would ask him to discuss for a few moments the degree to which perhaps this movement could be a positive force for bringing about liberal reforms in Turkey. My final 2 comments are, number one, in terms of foreign policy, which is not the subject here, but I think it's worth mentioning, there is no doubt that the zero-problem policy originally enunciated by Foreign Minister Davutoglu has certainly not worked out. And in fact, problems exist on every one of Turkey's borders. Moreover, Turkey seems to be adopting or searching for new allies and has shifted its its pro-US stance, perhaps as a result of US policy in Syria, to one that seems to be much more nuanced. For example, Turkey has just agreed to purchase Chinese anti-aircraft missiles, a decision which raises all kinds of important questions about Turkey's relations with the US, with NATO, and with the EU. And finally, to come back to the domestic issue, much of the AK's success has been due to its economic reforms, which have certainly propelled Turkey into a new economic status. What happens if that economic boom does not continue. Many people have talked about the fact that Turkey is undergoing an economic bubble. And surely there are important implications here for the future of Erdoğan, should he become president, of Erdoğan's candidacy for president, and perhaps even for AK rule in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joe, for those comments. Since we're doing pretty good for time, I'd like to give Mustafa a chance to respond, particularly on the questions that Joe raised with respect to the Ergenekon trial, the trial of the generals, the academics, the state of the media, as sort of one broad sort of theme, and then also the point that Joe raised about the possibility of the Gulen movement playing a corrective force for democracy in Turkey, and then the final point about Turkish foreign policy. We haven't talked about foreign policy. You didn't address it. If you could sort of give your sense of, what are some of the challenges and complications on facing Turkey with respect to its foreign policy orientation.
Well, thank you, Joe. I mean, you have legitimate points for sure, and I'm glad that you raised them. And let me explain how I see them. Well, only on the Chinese missile, I think they decided to buy it from China because it's $1 billion cheaper than the U.S. buy. I mean, think that was the reason. Still, they should be considered about their NATO. I mean, the government should be considered about the NATO commitments. But on these, I mean, this whole issue of Turkey, for example, there was a discussion in the U.S. when Turkey decided to buy, before the sanctions, made a oil deal with Iran and wanted to buy it from Iran. And the other, of course, oil source we have is Russia. And I've heard comments from the West why are you buying oil from Russia and Iran? And my answer, well, it's not Switzerland who's selling us. I mean, we have them next to us and we have to buy it from somebody. I mean, there are sometimes just rational, pragmatic economic considerations. In that sense, Turkey is not being simply oriented towards the West, but being global and opening up to every side, including China and whoever is around. But of course, we should be careful about NATO commitments and our also the human rights values, because in China you can get missiles, but you cannot get democracy. That's for sure. So going back to the issues that you raised. Yes, the Ergenekon sledgehammer cases have been excessive, and I'm one of the criticals inside Turkey of these cases. What are these? Well, these are basically cases in which the would-be junta members were caught by the police before they could launch a coup, or while they were contemplating about a coup, and they were put on trial for conspiring against the government. For example, the sledgehammer case is very illuminating. This is basically a brainstorming meeting by pretty hot-headed generals, headed by one of them, Çetin Doğan, in 2003, a couple of months after AKP came to power. It was a brainstorming meeting, and the generals were brainstorming. It was actually what you call a war game. For 2 days, they just went on. What we do if this happens. And the one big issue is what we do if Greece attacks us. I mean, that's a legitimate war game. But then the next question was, what about the government turns out to be too religious? And what do we do with them? So how do we overthrow them? How do we have So they were having this was life as normal in Turkish military. I mean, they were doing this for all the time. So they had this brainstorming meeting about how to topple the government if that might be necessary. And years later, this was a closed meeting. Years later, the proceedings of this meeting were given to the judiciary somehow by some officer inside. The police was wiretapping them. That's another thing. And all of these people were now put on trial and given 15, 16, 17 years prison for conspiring to overthrow the government. And my verdict, I mean, I'm not a judge, but is that, well, it is wrong to conspire against the government. And maybe the generals who were heading the meeting could have been persecuted. But there were just captains and lower-ranking people who sat there because it's a meeting of the military. They had nothing else to do. So in other words, there was a element in the Turkish military that was willing to take down the AKP. But the witch hunt against them has been excessive. So I agree with you on these trials. And It was not an imaginary threat, but the legal prosecution of this threat, I think, has been excessive. And why? Because the prosecutors who were allied with the AKP world, they saw this as the greatest battle ever against this deep state. And one more thing about a deep state. Turkey is a country. Turkey is a heaven of conspiracy theories. Everybody has a conspiracy theory about the other side. And this deep state has turned into another conspiracy theory by the liberals. I do agree that in Turkey we have a state establishment that has committed crimes. They executed people, Kurdish separatists especially, communists, and there has been some really state crimes by these hidden establishment. But not every evil in Turkey has been organized by two people. I mean, I think that's been just turned into an exaggerated claim. But there are conspiracy theories about everything, about the AKP, about the AKP's rivals, about this, about that, everything, unfortunately. Pressure on the media is indeed a big problem, and I think that's the darkest spot of the current democratic standards in Turkey. One thing, though, you don't go into jail for criticizing Erdoğan. The journalists who have been jailed have been blamed for violating the anti-terrorism law, which states that terrorist propaganda is a crime. And the journalists who have been in prison are generally either pro-PKK or pro-Marxist-Leninist violent groups. Journalists who have written pieces arguing for, the advance of that cause, like writing pro-PKK articles, which should not be a crime in I think, a free society. But that's the reason. The real AKP pressure on the media is manipulating media by using government's economic leverage to put pressure on the media bosses. Because most mainstream newspapers and channels in Turkey, big ones, are owned by businessmen who just don't own the newspaper, but have a whole bunch of companies. And they have to make the government happy if they want to get the next state contract about highways, for example. And since the political system is so centralized, and Erdoğan decides even a highway in the middle of Diyarbakir, this has always been like this before, and it's not something new. But AKP really is not. It has not changed this. It's actually using this almost unabashedly, obviously. So that's another dark spot. When I said Erdoğan can become a president, it can be a good idea. Of course, I didn't mean that if he can become a president with all the powers that he imagines. He had this idea of a super presidency, in which the president would be the combination of prime minister and president, and it would have almost unlimited powers. It was a very big threat, but he cannot go there. He cannot change the constitution to get that super presidency he wants. He just doesn't have enough votes in the parliament, enough seats. Even inside the AKP, there are people who are not happy with this super presidency idea. So he won't be able to do that. So he will probably become president in the presidential elections, which will be held for the first time, because in the past parliament was electing. Presidential elections will be held in June 2014. So he will probably become the president with the current powers, which mean there will be a prime minister, which will actually have the real power. And Erdoğan might want to leave a yes man behind. Maybe that's his ideal universe. But if that prime minister becomes somebody who actually has some vision that is different from that Erdoğan, which is possible, that can be a way forward. That's the only. Inshallah. One more thing, Fethullah Gülen movement. Yes, I agree with you on your observation there. Fethullah Gülen movement, if you don't know, it is one of the many Islamically inspired civil society movements in Turkey. One of the many, but the biggest one, but the best organized and the most modernized one, if you will. So their main issue is opening schools, educational facilities in not just Turkey, but everywhere in the world, even I'm sure some in the US, interfaith dialogue. So they are, from a theological perspective, they are religiously conservative, but a very moderate Islamic movement that wants to share their faith rather than imposing their faith, as I always say. And both the Fethullah Gülen movement and the Nursi tradition that they're coming from, Nursi was a previous scholar than Gülen who actually inspired Gülen as well. That is indeed a contribution to democracy because they've always distanced themselves from the radical Islamists and voted for center-right parties. And when the AKP joined Islamism and center-right, they supported the AKP too. But they are becoming growingly critical of this growingly Islamist tendency that we see in AKP circles. So there's a growing rift The Gülen movement would probably prefer to see Abdullah Gül or Bülent Arınç as the leader to go. Not because of personal bias against Erdogan, but just because Erdogan's style is a little it's not compatible with what they would like to see. And also there's a tension between the AKP government and the Gülen movement. For example, the government now wants to close down dershaneler. How do you say this in English? Like, these are educational institutions, not schools, to prepare students after class, like weekend schools that you go to just to get a better grade in the university exams, because there's a central university exam in Turkey. And Gülen movement has many of these things, and the government wants to curb these things now because Erdogan is not happy with this alternative Islamic voice that is aired by the Gülen movement. My argument is that whomever brings a diverse view among religious conservatives, that's good. I mean, Fethullah Gülen movement is one of them. There are anti-capitalist Muslims headed by İhsan Eliaçık, who's a small group, but they are interesting and they condemn Erdogan for crony capitalism. And actually, I'm a fan of free market, if economy rather than socialism. But I'm glad that they are there. They're bringing a different angle to the narrative. In that sense, of course, I mean, the anti-capitalist Muslims is a tiny group, but the Fethullah Gülen movement, they would not have their own political party and compete with AKP. But they are a balance tilting the AKP and the conservatives in general towards a more center-right point of view, which is also more friendly to the West when compared to some of the hardcore Islamist tendencies within the AKP, I must say.
Is that the leader of that movement, the Turk who lives in Pennsylvania?
Exactly. No.
And he is also anti-evolutionist. That's part of it. Very strident.
I mean, in Turkey, that's another controversy in Turkey. I think that's not his main issue, but he has given sermons, I think, in the 70s and 80s, criticizing Darwinian evolution.
He publishes great books also.
Oh, no, that's a different person you're talking about. Okay. That's Harun Yahya, another person who's actually a much more marginal figure in Turkey than compared to Fethullah Gülen. I mean, evolution, if you ask that question, I mean, Darwinian evolution has been rejected by many conservatives in Turkey, but I think we owe that partly to the Richard Dawkins type of propagandists in Turkey, which defined Darwinian evolution as basically a killer of the belief in God. So religious conservatives have taken a defensive attitude. But there are also Turkish theologians, Islamic theologians, who have said that while evolution just may be the way that God created, the natural universe. I mean, God created a universe, and the universe has its own natural mechanisms, and we don't have to reject that natural mechanism out of our faith in God. I mean, so there's a theistic evolutionary perspective as well. But if there's a reaction to Darwin evolution, it's because the Turkish left, secular hardcore Turkish left, also because they casted Darwin with Marx and Lenin like as the godfathers of the atheistic Marxist dialectical materialistic worldview. But thank you.
I'm going to give Joe an opportunity if you'd want to exercise it to respond or add anything more, and then we'll go to the questions in the audience.
Let me go to another point that you talked about. You talked about AK's policy towards the Kurds as being a very positive step. And certainly, I think most people would agree. The question, though, is, has it gone far enough? Because there are many people, certainly within the Kurdish community in Turkey, who do not feel that it has gone nearly far enough, and that to hail the Prime Minister for what he has accomplished to date is really giving him far too much credit. He hasn't gone around to dealing with the really underlying tensions that have sparked Kurdish nationalism and such ethnic violence in eastern Turkey for so many, many years.
Of course, some Kurdish nationalists are saying Erdogan is not giving us enough. But I think he's giving them as much as he can when 85% of the society is already very Turkish and against much of these reforms anyway. So, I mean, on that particular issue, Erdogan and is is between the Kurdish nationals, whom you can never win, whatever they want, always more, and the Turkish nationalists who think that you have given too much anyway. So in this sense, I mean, he has made some tactical mistakes. The bombing of 33 innocent villagers mistakenly was a big mistake, huge tragedy, and he didn't apologize enough, for example. So he has some issues to criticize for. But compared to previous Turkish leaders on the Kurdish issue, I mean, he's done the best reforms, and he's the only one who's now trying to end the war with the PKK by a peace deal. Whether it will work or not, we will see. Maybe it will fail again, it will restart again, but before the Erdoğan era, I mean, the mindset in Ankara was that we will kill these terrorists one by one. General had openly said this. And you were killing that guy, and his nephew was coming to take his revenge. It was this endless, vicious cycle of violence. Thank you.
Okay, let's open the floor to some questions and comments. Go ahead.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on any lasting effects from the Gezi Park protests and the larger protest movement that happened after that, whether on people's perceptions of Erdoğan or the AKP or Turkish politics society more generally. It seems like it was a very prominent problem for a while and was kind of faded away, but I'm curious to know if there are lasting impacts.
Yeah, could use that.
Thank you. Well, is it working? Can you hear me anyway?
He can hear you. It's working, no, because we're recording it, so speak into it, yeah. Yeah. We're going to turn it up.
Hang in there.
Good. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's working.
Well, now there's a Gezi party. They just established a party. But I don't expect that they will defeat the AKP in the upcoming elections. I mean, the Gezi Park movement has, of course, several layers. The core Gezi Park protesters were exactly like the people you would find in Occupy Wall Street, in Occupy Denver. I think there's a Denver version of that, as I understand. Like, these were left-wing environmentalists who were condemning capitalism, and they were against Erdoğan, not because he's an Islamist, but he's a crony capitalist who builds a skyscraper everywhere, and his friends get rich because of that, real or perceived. So that was the core issue in Gezi Park. But when Erdoğan just didn't listen to them, didn't care, and used police to disperse them to continue with his construction, more people joined it. Maybe they were not necessarily crazy about the park, but they were just angry at the government because they were thinking that Erdoğan, okay, he's elected, but he's just this very authoritarian leader elected. They don't deny that he's a legitimacy there. But they were critical of illiberal democracy, as I would say. Other people then joined who were angry at Erdoğan because he made a peace deal with the Kurds. They were hardcore Turkish nationals who didn't like his deal. So not everybody on the street was also very liberal and democratic minded too. Some hardcore left-wing groups in Turkey also joined the protests. And that's why when you went to Gezi Park, it was like a People's Republic of like international socialists, something. I mean, you had the Maoists and the Trotskyites and the Stalinists and the Maoists and the Pol Pot. I mean, there were no Pol Pot, okay. I'm just exaggerating. But there was a Enver Hoxha, like Albanian type communist strain still, you wouldn't believe. But so you had all these groups with their left, red flags. It became a bunch of crowd. And I didn't necessarily agree with everything they wanted. I mean, some of them wanted Erdoğan to stop the construction of the new airport in Istanbul because they're environmentalists, right? They say it will infringe with the birds' flight routes and so on, stuff like that. Well, I respect that, but I also think that we need an airport. I mean, so it's a choice between, of course, environmental concerns and development. And AKP is all about development. And so in that sense, it could have been a much lower scale event if Erdoğan acted more, in a more reconciliatory way, which Gül and Arış tried to do, but it didn't. Yet ultimately, it turned into a big mass process in various cities. Will this have any effect? Well, it does have an effect in the sense that I don't think those people will vote Erdoğan out of power unless they really have a promising main opposition against the AKP. But they shown to AKP people, at least the reasonable people in AKP, that getting the votes is not everything. you should get the votes, okay, but you should also find a way to have some dialogue with the opposition. And if you make this much, if you build this much tension in society, it comes out as protests, which you didn't foresee. So in that sense, it showed the power of the streets, if you will. But sometimes in a negative way, because some protesters were also violent. They threw Molotov cocktails in buildings. So, and actually, had the protesters been very principled and non-violent until the end, they would have a bigger moral legitimacy. Because then some people start to see them as just this people are attacking banks because they hate capitalism, you know, like that sort of. So there was this kind of violent strain in the Gezi Park too, which also delegitimized partly the Gezi Park movement, I think, in the eyes of conservatives and even some neutral observers.
Okay. Yeah, at the back.
Hi, I have a question that relates to both the accession to the European Union as well as gender discrimination or gender equality. So, if you look at democratization or assessing democracy in Turkey, oftentimes the gender dimension is kind of falling out of the picture. However, Turkey still has very few women in politics. There have been significant reforms like legal, family law, etc., but they rank at the bottom of most gender indices. So, against this background, how do you see accession to the European Union as a potential, as something good, as something bad, likely soon, likely later?
Well, good question. Actually, my wife Riyada, who's an expert on women's issues in Turkey, should maybe help you with this. She's right here if you wanna. You wanna say a few things, maybe Riyada, on this?
Yeah.
Why don't you come to the front?
Yeah, sure.
You touched my subject. Actually, I wrote an article recently, I'm a columnist in Turkey, that Erdoğan's policies are not Islamist but conservative, actually. What did I mean by that? There's obviously been a lot of drama in the past year or maybe so about President Erdoğan's campaign to have 3 kids. So he's asking every Turkish woman to kind of give a gift to the nation and have at least 3 kids because he thinks 1 kid is bankruptcy, 2 kids is 3 kids is, to keep the population going. Now, the critique immediately, as everything in Turkey goes through ideological lens, was that here is Erdoğan and his Islamist policies, and pretty much, when you research a little bit about it, you see that similar sort of things are happening in Germany, where Angela Merkel is also trying to push her own conservative policies through childcare and, through subsidizing financially women who choose to stay in homes rather than giving kids to childcare, which is inexistent in Turkey, actually. There's only a law currently that if a company has over 1,500 employees, has to have a childcare. So the other options are just really inexistent. Hence, Turkish women prefer to stay inside their homes. Secondly, religions have nothing to do with fertility rates, as it has been substantially, proven to anybody who reads a little bit, into it. The fertility rates go parallelly with development. Now, the average rate is 2.4, I think, 2.2, and Prime Minister Erdoğan can keep on calling for moms to have kids. Only a particular ideological part of the Turkish women will tap into that and do it, Otherwise, it is his right to say, you should have it. He doesn't have a right to say you must have it by any law, which is impossible anywhere. But what is important to understand, really, which shocked me personally, because I'm also, I'm Bosnian originally, but because of my husband, I've been in Turkey for a couple of years. The response of the employees to new family policies that the AKP government has introduced a month and a half ago, where they lengthened and prolonged the maternity leave from 16 to, I think, 20 weeks or 18 weeks. They also are going to give 300 lira, which is $150 to each mother who chooses to. Is this censorship? Should I even? Okay, I'm kidding. AKP is trying to kind of make these sort of policies that are going to kind of give choice to women, as they say it. However, the response of the employees in Turkey, which I found personally shocking, was they started a campaign to not hire women, which I think is much more scandalous than these sort of policies that are supposedly making female workers more expensive, right? And nobody has written about that. So I said, how about we a little bit do a critique of this sort of, I think, very sexist and horrific response by some of the employees over there. And to keep the long story short, because I could talk on this a lot, it is very crucial to also remember that in the past couple of decades in Turkey, and I have been learning more about the history, a lot of women who were wearing headscarf really were not allowed to go to university. I mean, Turkey has lost so much of its potential, let alone patriarchal culture, which is there. But this is a secret. While Mustafa was speaking, I had to check my email, and I saw an article which was published on Atlantic magazine, and it says, according to the poll, only 23% of the Americans would prefer a female boss, and that's a record high. So if this is the current state in America, which is, I think, 42nd in terms of gender equality, I mean, when we think about the Middle East and some countries that are over there, we really must take it into context. And if you think about it also, how it gets fascinated, in terms of CEOs, you have 3% or 4% of women who are CEOs in America and 12% of women who are CEOs in Turkey. Now, you know, it gets really, in terms of CEOs, more women are CEOs in Turkey. In terms of female participation, it's 27% in Turkey, which is so low. So I personally think that the end of the ban on the headscarf is a good thing. So these women, I mean, who have the right to get educated should be there. That's one thing. Second of all, I think that in those sorts of societies, you have to import some quota, because patriarchy is so ingrained that you have to kind of push for it first and then gradually make it a norm that it can be internalized. Otherwise, I mean, check out US. I was, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you for your question. It's very important in all Muslim countries, you know.
There was also a question that I think you didn't address, and that's the state of the Turkey's entry into the EU. Where do things stand with that?
Well, of course, it would be great if he entered the EU, but I don't see it coming very soon. The EU, I love the EU process rather than the EU itself. EU process gives you guidelines that you have to fulfill, and thanks to that, Turkey has been able to do many reforms under the AKP, but also towards the EU's encouragement. And still, for example, the latest progress report was good in the sense that it, you know, said, well, the government has done all these good things, but also they have all these mistakes, and media and Gezi Park and so on and so forth. In terms of women's issues, well, I agree with Riyad. I mean, I have to agree, and she knows better than everything on this issue, especially. But no, I do. I honestly agree. And well, the main problem in Turkey is not directed religion, but a patriarchy that has merged with sometimes religious sentiments. But also you can find it in the secular class too. And patriarchy in the sense that, I mean, you can find also very upper class Istanbuli women who would never work because let the husband work. And I mean, it's the guy's thing. Whereas, so you don't have, again, female participation, and not necessarily in a village in the predominantly Kurdish areas, which is obviously much underdeveloped. So to be able to defeat, I mean, that patriarchy is very, unfortunately, deeply ingrained in nationalism, in some religious sentiments as well. How this will change gradually, and is the AKP an obstacle? I don't think so, but one thing is that they are very family-minded. And I think some of the discussions between the AKP and the secular part in Turkish society is like Republicans here and, you know, the liberals. I mean, they would really support the family, and family is everything. And, well, that's a conservative policy that you can also find in some democratic states as well.
Good. Okay. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, last week we had Stephen Kinzer here, and he gave a talk about his idea for a reset in the Middle East, talking about sort of switching U.S. Focus away from Saudi Arabia and Israel, and actually more toward Turkey and trying to
Iran.
re-engage and re-approach with Iran. And I just would be curious to hear sort of your thoughts on that. Do you see if that's a possibility? Turkey maybe acting as maybe a mediator between the U.S. and Iran? Is that something possible?
Thank you. It's good that you ask. I actually reviewed that book for Foreign Affairs like a few years ago when it first came out. Stephen Kinzer is a very smart, I think, writer and journalist that I respect. That book was interesting as well. I don't see how will it be that possible to quickly build an alliance with Iran and the U.S. I'm glad that the current president of Iran is actually obviously much more reconciliatory and is willing to build a dialogue with the United States, and that has begun, and I'm happy to see that. But still, like building an alliance between Iran and the U.S. is not, I think, very foreseeable in the near future. Just when you look at Syria too, you can see how actually the two countries have very different positions with Israel as well. Still, some softening in Iran would be a better thing for Iranians themselves, for the U.S. and for the whole region. And one thing Turkey always wanted to do was to avoid a war with Iran. Not because we were happy with what Iran was doing in every issue, especially the nuclear issue, but we wanted to avoid wars in the region. They hurt us ultimately. As for U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Israel, well, I understand U.S. and Israeli relations are very special, like historic reasons. But I think U.S. would help both Israel and itself more if it takes steps which will define the U.S. as an honest broker between the Palestinians and Israelis, rather than always taking the side of Israel, as some people perceive in the Middle East for some reasons. And as for Turkey, well, I think U.S.-Turkey relations had ups and downs in the past before, but I think they are here to stay. And the AKP even they sometimes take a step that, one thing, being a U.S. ally should not mean being a yes man for Washington. So you should be able to have your choices. And there has been cases in the past 10 years that Turkey disagreed with Washington, and look, maybe Turkey was not that wrong. I mean, Turkey disagreed with the Iraqi war, and I think maybe it was not the best idea in the first place, right? I mean, as many people think today. So those disagreements will happen here and there, but I think the alliance between the two countries are unbreakable, and it will go on, whoever is in power.
Great. Tamara?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the illiberal democracy theme and the toleration or tolerance for dissent, or at least alternative voices. The first question related to that is coming back to Joe's point about the academics that were jailed, if you could say a little bit more about that. And also maybe about what kind of reaction emerged to your book on the Kurdish question.
Okay, sure. Well, a few academics were jailed, and I think maybe all of them are probably free now during these Ergenekon and trials. One academic, Büşra Ersanlı, was jailed during the KCK trials, which is about the Kurdish pro-PKK network. And I think in all these cases, I've been against all of these cases and I've written extensively in Turkey. But the main problem was this very draconian traditions of the Turkish judiciary and their inability to make a distinction between ideas and criminal acts. For example, Büşra Ersanlı, a professor who has Marxist views, and she's a part of the Kurdish Nationalist Party, the BDP, which is like what's Sinn Féin to IRA, which is to PKK, and she has been lecturing about resistance, actually peaceful resistance, in the academy of the. So that was perceived by Turkish prosecutors as training the terrorists, and it was true that some people in the audience maybe threw a Molotov cocktail in a rally against the. But those very indirect links were taken as evidence for prosecuting these people, which is not new in Turkey. That's how Turkish judiciary has been unfortunately structured, their logic. And AKP at some points brought some legal reforms to curb these things, and ultimately those have been released because they changed the wording of the anti-terrorism law, for example. Yet still we have a big problem with the logic of the Turkish judiciary. The Turkish judiciary has been designed to protect the state, not the individuals. And whomever has the state can benefit from this. In this case, sometimes the current government. But there was actually a poll by TESEV, a liberal think tank, in 2006. judges were asked, what do you protect? What's your duty? And the great majority of them said, I protect the state. Human rights comes much later. So that's the main paradigm which put those people in jail because of their links with the terrorists. Some ideological maybe affinity turned into a link in the eyes of some people. The second question was, sorry.
About your book on
Oh,
Kurds.
my books. Yeah, I love to speak about them, you know. Well, actually, my new book is here. I mean, that's even better, you know, this one. But my older book, the Kurdish book, the Rethinking the Kurdish Question, well, it's been a good book that actually opened the way for me in Turkish media to become a commentator who's really always has an opinion about everything, although I don't know everything that well. But the Rethinking the Kurdish Question, what went wrong, what next, it was a book which really tried to tell to the Turkish mind that what the Kurds want and what's their problem. Well, they have a problem because we actually bend their culture. But it was not a pro-PKK book. It was critical of the PKK and Kurdish nationalism as well. But it was also criticizing the state's nationalist paradigm, which perceived everybody as a Turk and wanted to Turkify everybody. And it was a historical evaluation. It's based on my actually master thesis on the same question. It was actually explaining how things were actually more liberal under the Ottoman era, where Kurds were never oppressed, and nobody thought that you should convert them into something else, into Turks. And the book did well. It's received praise from liberal Turks and some Kurdish intellectuals as well. And it's been okay. I mean, it's several prints, and a new version is actually coming out. Yeah, I mean, it helps. But this book is better. Just check that.
Okay, let's maybe take one more question from Danny, and then we'll shut it down.
Are you sure you don't have a question?
I have a question. So,
Afterwards, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for your talk, Mustafa. And Syria has come up just sort of peripherally, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about it because you've listed a number of complaints against the AK Party and against Prime Minister Erdoğan from various sectors of Turkish society and different, kind of an array of criticisms. But when I was in Turkey in May, it struck me how divisive the issue of Turkey's policy on Syria had become, not only in Turkish society as a whole, but even within the AK Party, although this was less, I think, publicly aired. It was more in conversations I was having with people that there were whispers of real dissent within the AK Party over Turkish policy on Syria. So if you could, and maybe not everyone in the room is aware of this history and what is Turkish policy on Syria. So if you could just give us the big picture, like where does Turkish foreign policy stand on Syria today? Why? And how does that play out internally in terms of domestic politics?
Thank you so much for this question. That's the thing it's a very important point that I really forgot. Syria is a burning issue for Turkey. First of all, it's a huge humanitarian crisis. We have 600,000 refugees right now. It's increasing every day from Syria, and the government has created these camps for them. They're taken care of. The government is taking care of the refugees well, but it's a huge issue. First of all. Secondly, yes, it is a very divisive issue in Turkish politics right now as well. The AKP government actually right before the Arab Springs had very good relations with the Syrian regime. Zero problem with neighbors. Actually, Exhibit A was Syria. You see, we solved our problems with Syria, and Turkey opened up its borders, a lot of trade, good for both countries. Bashar Assad and Erdoğan were, talking to each other. Actually, Turkey was brokering a deal between Syria and Israel, peace deal, before, everything went, two different ways, both with Israel and Syria. But the Arab Spring changed everything, and AKP did not foresee this. They reacted to this. And I think they took the right side, but they couldn't, of course, change the course of events in Syria. Maybe they thought they could. What happened was that when the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, in Egypt, Erdoğan went out because his big narrative is democracy. I mean, Erdoğan is the biggest defender of democracy in Turkey, but it's not a very liberal democracy when you look at all the details. But in terms of elections and the legitimacy of elections, that's the sacred narrative. And I believe in that. I mean, elections of course, should be respected. He defended free elections in Tunisia, in Egypt. He even defended secular states to Egyptians, which was interesting. When it came to Syria, since they had good relations with the regime for a while, for several months, they tried to persuade the regime not to fire on the peaceful protesters and not, use violence against the people who just went on the streets. The regime did not listen to that advice, obviously. And at some point, AKP threw its lot and Erdogan started to condemn Assad. This was also because of the fact that refugees were coming into Turkey, even in the first months. And you were listening their horror stories, what happened to these people by the regime. And of course, AKP already had connections with the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, so they were already, they knew these people, and they were getting how horrible the regime was, and all the slaughter and tortures and so on and so forth. So after several months of trying to mediate, they condemned the regime, and AKP began the biggest support of the Syrian opposition. And until very recently, who was the Syrian opposition didn't matter that much. Anybody who fights Assad is on the right side, was the view. But growingly recently, now the AKP too realizes that some of the people who fight Assad are also problematic. They're Al-Qaeda and similar groups. They now blame Al-Qaeda for betraying the Syrian revolution, for creating human rights violations and so on and so forth, but that has become a more recent issue. Well, inside Turkey, Erdogan has been criticized interestingly, by some hardcore Islamists, pro-Iranian hardcore Islamists, and the secular nationalists to be an American puppet in Syria. Because, there's a strong current of Turkish nationalism, ulusalcılık as we call it in Turkish. These are people who think that Atatürk was an anti-imperialist hero, Turkey should not never enter NATO, NATO was the imperialist, blah, blah, blah. That's a very strong line in CHP as well. So they think that all the trouble in Syria is created by American spies, and while Assad was wonderful, and Erdogan is an American puppet who plays into this American conspiracy to topple yet another secular regime to bring his Islamists, which would be American puppets. How this all works, I don't know, but it works. So, interestingly, the CHP criticized AKP to be on the Western side on Syria. Some hardcore Islamists, of course, some pro-Iranian little pockets in Turkey as well. They also blame Erdogan to be getting into this imperialist NATO, American conspiracy on Syria. That's one thing. The other thing is that there are also some Alevis in Turkey, and especially Arab Alevis in Turkey, who sympathize Assad out of sectarian ties. And they also now are condemning Erdogan to support the terrorists in Syria, which is the Syrian opposition. And Gezi was actually also partly a reflection of this tension, because while Gezi began in Istanbul as a movement by tree-hugging, yoga-doing liberals, in Hatay, Antioch, Syrian border, it turned into pro-Assad protest against Erdogan's government. That was a part of the Gezi too. And a few deaths happened in that area, in which things got really like tense. So in that sense, the sectarian tension in Syria is even having some sectarian implications within Turkey. Thank God it's not becoming a violent war. It's not going to be that way. And let's not forget that the main opposition, CHP, also has some support from the Alevi community in Turkey. And the Alevi...
To be clear, the Alevis, Turkish Alevis, are not the same people as Syrian Alawites.
Not, but there are Alevites of the same nature in southern Turkey. There are Arab Alevites who are Turkish citizens in Hatay. But a great majority of them are sympathetic to Assad. And as for Turkish Alevis, which are not exactly, of course, the same as the religious sect with the Alevites we call them Nusayris, and we call Turkish Alevis Alevis. Turkish Alevis are not Nusayris, but still, Assad looks nicer to them for some reason. I mean, still he's not Sunni, still he's secular. Still some Alevi-ish connection there, so there is some sympathy there. At least less hostile. They're less hostile to Assad than AKP was. So in that sense, the Syrian war is also poisoning the political atmosphere in Turkey as well. And that's why Erdogan should be very careful not to provoke the Sunni Alevi tensions in Turkey, whereas he very carelessly, put the name of the Sultan Yavuz Sultan Selim on the third bridge he will build, and that's the Sultan that Alevis know as the Alevi Slayer in history. And that's why some people were on Gezi, because they were protesting the government for provoking Alevi. So Erdoğan is at an era that he should be very careful, but it is his most careless and reckless period. It's really bad.
Okay. Mustafa, I know you're on a busy book tour. We appreciate
We're going
you.
to Portland in 2 hours, so we
Okay,
have to
so we have to get going. Thank you for coming.
You're
And
welcome.
Joe, thank you for your comments as well.
It was a pleasure. Well, definitely. Thanks so much.